I suffer from schizophrenia. Before you jump to any conclusions about me, before that word schizophrenia flashes its stigma and makes you think of serial killers, mass shooters, and the like, let me dispel a few things. I am not Norman Bates. I am not Ted Bundy. As a matter of fact, most sufferers of this illness shy away from violence. I do not have multiple personalities. Dissociative identity disorder is a completely different condition than what I have. Most of the time I'm just like you. I go to work, I watch television, I read books, listen to music, indulge my hobbies, and spend time with people I love. I just occasionally see and hear things that aren't really there. When this happens, when I hallucinate or hear voices, I refer to these episodes as experiencing interference, because that is how it feels to me. They are interruptions in my everyday life. It's also a good way for me to signal to someone I trust, who knows about my condition, that I'm in the midst of an episode without having to use that word. I simply tell them, I'm sorry, there's some interference happening, and they understand. Not everyone is understanding. My father was one of these people. I was diagnosed at a very young age. I was only 6 when a child psychiatrist reluctantly wrote schizophrenia onto my diagnostic chart. It's not a diagnosis assigned lightly, especially to children. Most people with this illness don't begin displaying symptoms until the late teens or early 20s. I was 6. However, in a weird way, I consider this a blessing. I never had to experience the jarring phenomenon of living a normal life to suddenly having the carpet pulled beneath my feet. Better to be born blind than lose your sight later in life. I've never known anything else. This has also given me a long time to come to terms with my illness and learn to live with it. I take medication, and as long as I stay on them, most of my days are just as boring and mundane as everyone else's. Mild episodes will always happen, but the big ones, the ones ranging on the scale 8 or above, are few and far between. The most difficult thing about living with schizophrenia is not always being able to tell what is real from what is not. Sometimes it's very clear. If I see a purple elephant riding a tricycle through my living room, I can pretty much assume that it isn't real and not give it much thought. The ones that get to me are the more subtle ones. Answering a phone that wasn't ringing, responding to someone calling my name when there was no one, attempting to sit in a chair that's not really there. This sort of thing can be extremely embarrassing when they happen in public, so I tend to stay away from most people. I know I come across as creepy to some, strange. It's like they know there is something off about me, but just can't pinpoint what it is. Another annoying thing about this illness are the delusions. I have been fortunate though. I haven't been plagued by delusions the way some schizophrenics are. I don't believe the government has planted a chip in my brain, or that I have been abducted by aliens. I don't buy into conspiracy theories or anything like that. However, there is always that danger. I'm always afraid of going off the deep end that way, so I avoid anything that might trigger it. Sometimes all it takes for a simple idea to take root, a word, a phrase, it's not always purple elephants. Oftentimes, it's something much worse. One thing I avoid above all else is religion. I don't mean that to sound disrespectful to anyone who is religious. A common delusion for schizophrenics to fall into is the belief that they are hearing the voice of God, or that their hallucinations are actually angels or demons trying to show them visions. I've even had well-meaning people tell me that I'm not mentally ill at all, that I'm gifted. I can see into the spiritual realm whereas others can't. Of course, that's ridiculous. This is not a gift, yet I do fear someday believing it. Who wouldn't want to believe that they are special that way? I suppose that's why it's such a common thing. Yet, it's very dangerous thinking. As appealing as the notion of being chosen by God is, the reality is that I have an illness. It isn't pretty. It isn't romantic. It just is. Besides that, I don't have such a great track record with religion. My father, I mentioned him earlier, was a Southern Baptist preacher in the backwoods of Louisiana where I grew up. He was a devout Christian and held his family, myself included, to strict standards. We were examples for the community, and he took that position very seriously. In public, anyway. Behind closed doors, things were quite different. My father drank heavily and had a hellfire and brimstone temper. It went even beyond that, however. There was a meanness in him, a side the rest of the congregation never saw. He reveled in his position of power over his followers, and that bled heavily into our home life. We weren't his family. We were his flock. You see this scar across the corner of my mouth? That was delivered with a strip of barbed wire. I could show you my arms and my back as well, but I keep these covered. No matter the weather, I'm always in long sleeves. Having a schizophrenic son was not news my father took well. At first, he didn't believe there was such a thing. He was convinced I was behaving this way for attention, claiming to see things that weren't real. Then it got more sinister. My father became seized with the idea that was in fact possessed. My hallucinations were satanic visions. I was hearing the voice of the devil. That's when I stopped being human in my father's eyes. I was no longer his son. I was a thing to be tormented whenever he saw fit. He derived a sick pleasure in not just the physical torture, the beatings, the burns, the chokings, the cuts, but the psychological torture as well. He stopped calling me by my name and instead used nicknames like Schizo or, his personal favorite, Hellspawn. He enjoyed taking advantage of my fragile psychological state. He would say or do things he knew would trigger an episode, and then use that as further evidence that I was filled with the devil. One day, when I was about 7, he came home in a drunken stupor as usual, but this time he clutched something in his left hand as he staggered through the front door. At first, I thought it was some sort of dead rodent, but when he brought it into the light, it was clear. It was a teddy bear, torn in places, with matted fur and bald spots. In his gravelly, slurred voice, he tossed it at my face and said, "Here you go, Hellspawn. Pulled that out of the dumpster for you. Mind you watch out, it's got a mind of its own." With that, he plopped on the sofa and passed out. Mind of its own. That's all it took. That simple phrase. A seed was planted. I regarded the haggard thing my father had thrown at me. It stank. I believed him when he said he pulled it from the garbage. My first inclination was to just throw it away. In a few hours, my father would probably not even remember giving it to me and would never miss it. But what if he did? What if he got angry that I tossed it out? Hanging onto a smelly, rotten stuffed animal seemed more appealing than whatever punishment my father might inflict on me, so I took it up to my room. This was most likely some sort of mind game. He wanted to see how long he could make me keep this thing, make me sleep with it, make me take it to school, make me eat meals with it. As his petty torments went, this seemed pretty mild, so I figured I could take it. It was just an old bear, after all. But those words kept seeping into my brain. Mind of its own. I began to regard the bear with suspicion. When I was 7, I didn't have the discernment skills to be able to tell when a delusion or an episode was about to take over. I'm much older now and I've lived with this for years. I now have coping skills and strategies I can use to combat things like this. But back then, I did not. I stared into the beady plastic eyes of the bear, and I could feel it staring back at me. It has a mind of its own. I threw the bear across the room. It landed face down on the wooden floor. I decided then that I wasn't going to take it into the bed with me. I would just leave it there on the floor. I went to bed, and after what felt like hours of lying still with one eye fixed on the bear, I managed to fall asleep. I'm not sure how long I slept. It may have been a couple hours or just a few minutes. but I was awakened by a strange wooden sound. I say wooden because it sounded like snapping twigs and creaking branches. When I opened my eyes, they were already pointed in the direction where the bear laid, still on the floor, but now it was changing. Its furry limbs twisted and lengthened in a jerking and unnatural way. That was the cracking noise I was hearing. Its arms and legs grew and jerked, lengthening and thinning like spider legs. Finally, it lifted its head from the floor. It was swollen to several times its original size, and distended across from fluffy ear to fluffy ear was a row of sharp teeth that dripped with drool. I opened its jaw and released a roar that shook the room. I felt its hot breath hit me in the face, and I bolted from the bed. I ran into the hall and headed for the stairs. Behind me I could hear the sounds of crackling wood as the thing lifted itself to its feet. I turned to look and it scrambled behind me, walking on spindly legs and using its spider-like arms to dig its claws into the opposite walls of the hallway to propel itself forward. The house rattled with its growls. As I reached the stairs, I slipped on the top step and tumbled to the bottom floor. I twisted my ankle in the process and couldn't get back to my feet. I looked up the stairs, and staggering its way down was this monstrosity. No longer a teddy bear, but a scarecrow-like thing with the skin of a teddy bear stretched across its wooden skeleton. It opened its mouth again and spoke. "It's lovely out in the woods today, but safer to stay at home. For every bear that ever there was will gather there for certain, because today's the day the teddy bears have their picnic." I screamed and closed my eyes, sliding myself back across the floor like a slug. I began reciting a nursery rhyme that sometimes brought me comfort when I was having an episode. I tried to remind myself that this wasn't real. As I was going up the stairs, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. As I was going up the stairs, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. I whispered this to myself over and over. When I opened my eyes, I was in my mother's arms. She was shaking me and calling my name. I looked past her worried face and up toward the stairs. My father stood at the top, with the bear in his hands. "What's wrong with him now?" he said. "I'm not sure," she said. "I think he had another night terror." "Figures," my father said in that familiar, dismissive tone. "Gonna chain you to the bed. Boy, if you don't cut this shit out." He threw the bear at me again and disappeared into the hallway. My mother carried me back up to bed. For the next few nights, this happened again and again. The bear would transform into the monster, chasing me, and my mother would find me in various places in the house, hiding in closets or in cabinets, shaking and reciting nursery rhymes. After the 6th night, my mother begged my father to let her get rid of the bear. She offered to burn it, bury it, whatever it took. My father just smugly smiled and said, "You'd burn a gift a father gave his son? How ungrateful." Somehow, my father was still more terrifying than anything my broken mind could invent. Even so, the constant disturbances during the night were wearing on him too, so he made good on his promise to restrain me to my bed. The 7th night, he tied me down with ropes and sat the bear square on my chest. "Sleep tight," he said as he closed my bedroom door. It wasn't long before I felt vibrations on my chest as a low growl began to rise from the bear. Slowly, its mouth began to stretch across its face in a toothy, distended fashion. Immediately, I closed my eyes and began to recite the rhyme. Over my own voice, though, I could hear that crackling sound. It was growing again, transforming. I abandoned the rhyme and instead began to scream. I called for my mother. I struggled and strained against the ropes until they began to cut into my wrists, and I felt blood trickle down my arm. I could hear voices in the hall. My mother first. "Let me go to him, please. He's having a nightmare. And then my father, stop babying him. He's driving us all crazy as he is. You want to stop to it? I'll make it stop. What happened next is a blurry mix of hallucination and reality. To this day, I'm not quite sure what actually transpired. I remember my father bursting into my bedroom. I remember the door flinging open and crashing against the wall behind. I remember the crackling noise the bear made as it grew. I remember the bear's voice. Today's the day the teddy bears have their picnic. There was a scream, but not my own this time. My eyes were clenched tightly shut and I just kept repeating. As I was going up the stairs, I met a man who wasn't there. He wasn't there again today. I wish he'd go away. There were growls and roars, crashes, the sound of ripping flesh and screaming. Then silence. Finally, my mother came in. She saw me tied to the bed and ran to me, frantically removing the ropes from my bloody wrists. My father was nowhere to be seen. The bear lied face down on the wooden floor, as it had the first night when I had thrown it aside. After attending to my wounds and making sure I was all right, my mother asked me, "Where's your father?" I looked up at her and simply shook my head. That was nearly 30 years ago. The community assumed that my father must have wandered away in a drunken stupor and had some sort of accident. There was a search in the nearby woods, but nothing was ever found. I still have the teddy bear. Never since that night has it ever transformed again. It's just a bear, just an old, worn teddy with dead plastic eyes and balding fur. When I first saw it, it frightened me, but I was just a child then, and now I understand that it was all a delusion brought on by my illness. However, for reasons I can't quite describe, I have a certain respect for this old thing. Sometimes, the scariest things in this world are just misunderstood, sort of like me. After all of us have a mind of our own. There was a strange noise coming from downstairs. Dap thump, feet resounding against the wooden floor. But why did they sound so uneven? It might have been a strange waking nightmare. I'd been having trouble sleeping lately. When Mom called the next morning, I didn't mention the sounds, or the headaches, or the nausea. "Are you sure you're feeling okay?" she asked. "Maybe I should come home early." "No, I'm fine, trust me." She was always so overprotective. That night, the noise kicked up again as something boomed up the staircase. Dap thump, dap thump. My limbs froze. I sat perfectly still and listened carefully. The house was ghost quiet. It was probably just a fever dream. Sleep came in short bursts. One day drifted into the next. The courage to leave my room only came when it was bright outside. Each time I stood up, my stomach churned like it was on a roller coaster, and I couldn't shake the feeling like hidden eyes were crawling all over my skin. The footsteps thudded again, faster than before. Dap thump, dap thump. They made their way through the upstairs hall. Dap thump, and stopped right outside my bedroom. A floorboard creaked. My eyes bulged out of their sockets as 4 tiny appendages reached under the door. A child's fingers. A scrap of paper slid into the room. Then the dap thump sound moved down the hall. I leaned over the edge of the bed. In front of me was a note. It said, "You aren't safe." Just a fever dream. If Mom knew what was happening, she'd race straight home, so I kept lying whenever she called. "Everything's fine. I just need a rest." Dap thump, dap thump. Another scrap of paper slid into the room. This one had a crayon drawing of a monster clutching a knife. There were words scribbled beneath it. "Pig Man is coming." Imaginary spiders scurried across my back, sending a shiver along my spine. What was a pig man? My nightmares became plagued with flashing images of terrible snouts and hooved feet. In one, a group of ferocious hogs chewed at my stomach lining while I lay on an oak table. The shiny red apple lodged in my throat stifled my screams. When I woke up, the pillow was soaked with sweat. Fever dreams. When I next heard the sound, it was dashing up and down the hall. Dap thump, dap thump. It moved through the house, opening and closing drawers. Dap thump, dap thump. The sound disappeared into my parents' bedroom, producing a thudding echo. Then, stillness. I went back to sleep. The following morning, there was a photo album on my parents' bed. Opened at a picture of 2 children. There was a baby, who I recognized, and a girl who I didn't. She looked strangely familiar. "Do I have a sister?" I asked my mom, staring at the photo. She paused for a moment as if confused by the question. "What?" "Do I have a sister?" I repeated. "You know you don't." "But did I ever have one?" She said nothing. I spoke in an assertive tone. "Did I ever have a sister? Answer me." "You're delirious. Your father and I are going to catch the next flight home." I got Dad's shotgun from the tool shed. Would it hurt a ghost? Probably not, but having it made me feel safe. Dap thump, dap thump. She was back, and what's worse, I was too sick to stand. It felt like I was trapped inside a furnace. My mouth was dry with terror. The bedroom door creaked open, then something crossed the room. Dap thump, dap thump. I craned my neck and saw her. The girl from the photo. She was about 7. Her frame was bent, each limb wrenched at an extreme angle. One foot pointed sideways, and there was naked skull. She watched me, unblinking. My breathing stopped. The little girl looked scared for some reason. That terrified me. She spoke in a quiet voice. "Please don't go back to sleep. Pig Man is coming." She vanished. Terrible images of humanoid pigs flashed through my mind. It took every last ounce of strength my body could summon to stand and face the door. A new noise came from downstairs. Thump, thump, thump. These footsteps were different from the others. They were heavier, more ominous. It was how a pig man might have sounded. I couldn't help thinking. The adrenaline pumping through my veins barely kept me awake. The barrel of the gun trembled. The footsteps passed through the kitchen, into the dining room. Thump, thump, thump. The sound, or its maker, was traveling through the house in a stealthy sort of way. It didn't want to be heard. The footsteps climbed the stairs. Thump, thump, thump. They were slow and careful, deliberate. Doors opened and closed throughout the house. The pig man was searching for something, or someone. My head was swimming. The steps came to a halt outside my room. Thump. Panic swelled in my chest. I could feel a heavy presence, bestial and vicious, on the other side of the door. This was no fever dream. The handle turned. Why did the pig man want to come inside so badly? I hid behind the door. A looming presence, so tall it had to duck through the frame, stepped inside. I bit my bottom lip so hard it drew a trickle of blood. The shadowy figure craned its neck, surveying the room. When it finally settled on me, I saw a hideous snout and 2 dark sunken holes. My pulse skyrocketed. Without warning, it lunged forward, I squeezed the trigger. The shot was deafening. The figure staggered back and hit the wall, staining it red. I reloaded. Before I could fire again, the figure disappeared. A trail of thick, dark blood receded down the hall and around the corner. I heard the pigman tumble down the stairs, grunting all the way. The walls started bobbing from side to side, as though I was standing on a boat caught in a fierce storm. The last thing I remember is a light bulb swirling above my head. When I woke up, a paramedic was hunched over me. 2 police officers were standing behind him. The neighbors had heard the gunshots and called the authorities. They found a man wearing a rubber pig's mask crawling through the backyard. He was later identified as the one responsible for a series of fatal home invasions. I told the police what happened, leaving out the part about the girl. They said I was lucky to be alive. When my parents got home, they made a huge fuss, of course. Mom insisted I stay in bed and checked my temperature 50 times a day. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to ask her again whether I had a sister or not. "Why would you think that?" she asked. I told her about the photo of me as a baby and the girl I didn't recognize. She clutched her chest. "The truth is, you had a sister. Her name was Abby. She died in a car accident when you were less than a year old. We were waiting for the right moment to..." Her voice trailed off. We cried and hugged. Later that night, after both my parents had gone to sleep, I heard the footsteps one final time. Dap thump, dap thump. Another scrap of paper slid underneath the door. This one was a crayon drawing of me holding hands with a little girl like the one in the photo. Hovering above us was a purple heart. When I woke up the next morning, my fever broke. Some of my favorite childhood memories took place at my grandparents' cabin. My older brother, Louis, and I would come every spring break and stay for the week. Our cousins came as well. We would spend the day swimming at the lake and driving around the neighborhood in the golf cart, affectionately named Alfie, and playing with the neighborhood dogs. The days were a blast. The nights, however, weren't my favorite times. My older cousin, Justin, invented a little game. It was excruciatingly simple. Basically, we took turns spending 15 minutes in the dark, cramped guest bedroom closet by ourselves. There was nothing special about this closet. The only scary thing about it was that it was a dark room in the bedroom at the back of the house, far away from the safety of the living room, where our beloved grandmother sat in her chair watching Cheers and Frasier every evening. To my 6-year-old self, it may as well have been hell itself to be in the dark by myself. I never did make it for the whole 15 minutes. None of the younger cousins did, a fact which our older cousins used to relentlessly tease us. The 3 older kids, Louis, Justin, and Amaya, all managed to spend the full 15 minutes in the closet, and they all had different stories for what they experienced. Louis claims a ghostly white woman grabbed at his throat. Amaya said a little boy with no eyes appeared beside her, laughing maniacally. But the story that scared me the most was Justin's. He claimed a man with glowing red eyes sat across from him in the closet. "And do you know what he told me, Austin?" he asked me in his dramatically low voice. For a kid of only 10, he sure was a good storyteller. "What?" I asked, peeking out from my blanket, trying and failing to hide my fear. He told me how I would die, how and when, every detail. His eyes gleamed as he spoke, boring into mine. "And, well, how does it happen?" I challenged,
secretly hoping he'd end the story already. I don't think you want me to tell you that. See, it's a very gruesome death, very violent, but I can stop it from happening. All I have to do is tell someone about it. He smiled wickedly. Then it will happen to them, not me. I haven't decided who I'm going to tell yet. He winked. So maybe you should keep that in mind next time you don't want to give up your turn driving Alfie. Looking back now, it was pretty lame, and part of me knew that no kid would be so nonchalant about his upcoming demise, especially one he deemed the worst possible way to go. But any time we would both reach for the last cookie, or fight over whose turn it was to play a game, he would grin and say, "Are you sure you want to make me mad, Austin? You wouldn't want me to tell you a little story now, would you?" And I would always give in. It just didn't seem worth the risk. So, that was the closet game. Justin, Lewis, and Amaya all loved it. The younger cousins, however, dreaded those nights when one of the older kids would grin and say, "Let's see if any of you can last in the closet tonight." My younger cousins were Amaya's younger sisters, 7-year-old Lena and 6-year-old Macy. Because they were both girls, the older kids, specifically Justin, didn't hound them nearly as much about being too chicken to last as he did me. "Don't worry about it, man," Lewis told me in private one night as we lay down in the guest bedroom for bed after playing the game. "He only gives you a hard time because you react. It's not a big deal if you can't stay in a stupid closet for 15 minutes. Lewis was always much nicer to me when other kids weren't around. "Well, I'm gonna do it one day. I know I will," I declared. I was embarrassed that I'd once again ran out screaming after only a minute or two of sitting alone in the dark. "Sure you will, dude," Lewis yawned, and after a few minutes, his light snores filled the room as I stared at the watermarked ceiling, wide awake and reeling at how patronizing his tones sounded to my ears. "He's not the best brother, is he?" a voice hissed, jolting me out of my thoughts. I sat straight up in bed and glared at where I thought the voice had come from. The closet. The door was still open a crack. I stared at the sliver of darkness within. I started to think the voice must have been my imagination, when a pale white hand extended out of the black and beckoned me close. "Don't be afraid, Austin. I just want to talk." That's when I realized I recognized the voice. "Grandma," I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. "Come here, Cricket." The voice was definitely hers, although there was something off about it. It wasn't her usual cheery voice. It was lower, more gravelly, sinister somehow. But the use of my grandma's special nickname for me lowered my guard a bit. I slowly lowered my feet to the floor and cautiously crept towards the closet. "Grandma," I repeated, "what are you doing in there?" I could barely make out her frail shape within the small space. She looked to be crouched on all fours, peering through the opening towards me. As my eyes adjusted, I could see that she was smiling. "You sure have been letting the bigger kids get away with a lot lately, haven't you, Cricket?" "What do you mean? Why are you in the closet? I thought you went to bed." I looked over my shoulder at the door, thinking of going to Grandma's room. "Look at me when I'm talking to you, young man." I snapped back to attention. It was so rare for Grandma to snap at any of us kids. I wasn't used to the bite that was suddenly in her tone. Her face was right against the crack of the closet now. It was my grandma, but not. This woman was grimy. Dirt in the lines on her face. Her teeth were cracked and stained yellow, and her eyes were pure black, darker than the room around her. They seemed to suck me in, like they were absorbing me somehow. I couldn't look away if I wanted to. "Nobody but wimps allows treatment like that," she whispered, those black eyes holding mine. "Brothers are supposed to look out for you, stand up for you, believe in you. When is the last time your brother told Justin to leave you alone?" Never. Lewis never defended me to Justin. He was too much of a coward to stand up to the cool older cousin. My grandma grinned at me. "You know what you should do, Cricket." Austin, get off of him. What are you doing?" I suddenly felt several pairs of hands grabbing me and yanking me away. I fell hard to the floor as excited voices yelled all around me. "Lewis, are you okay? Is he breathing? Oh God, he's okay. Oh, thank you, God, thank you. Lewis, what happened?" "I don't know. He just went nuts. I don't know." I sat on the floor, trying to process the scene around me. Grandma and all of my cousins were huddled around Lewis, who was sitting up in bed looking as dazed as I felt. I suddenly realized I was holding a pillow, and the lamp next to the bed had been smashed. The pieces slowly came together over the next hour. Lewis had awoken very suddenly when a pillow was slammed over his face. He fought against it but was surprised at how strong the force was. Luckily, his thrashing had knocked over the lamp, which had awoken my cousins sleeping next door, and they had roused my grandma. They ran into the room to find me leaning on the pillow over my brother, an enraged look on my face. It was so out of character for me. I had always been a very timid and easygoing child. Nobody expected such an act of violence out of me. My parents took me to therapy, of course. I told them what I could remember, that my grandmother had come in the room and told me to do it. That was, of course, ridiculous. My grandmother had been sound asleep in her room. There was no question about this, considering all of my cousins had to wake her up to get her to come save my brother. The therapist never could give my parents any satisfactory answers on why I seemingly snapped. The relationship between my brother and me obviously took a huge hit after that night. It took a long time for him to hang out with me again, even longer to stop sleeping with his bedroom door locked. But eventually, as the months went on without me taking another attempt at his life, he started to relax. My family stopped watching me from the corners of their eyes like I was a bomb about to go off. The event was chalked up to me being a little boy who was angry at being picked on and didn't know how to express my anger. They kept me in therapy for a while longer, but I had quickly learned not to mention the woman who whispered to me from the closet. I was smart enough to just go along with what the therapist instructed me to do. Breathing exercises when I get angry, talking about my feelings instead of burying them, etc. And those visits eventually ended as well. That was over 20 years ago. It was little more than an unpleasant memory until last week, when my wife, my 5-year-old son, and I traveled back to my hometown to help my parents arrange my grandmother's funeral. She had passed peacefully in her sleep, and we all knew it had been a long time coming, considering the woman was in her late 90s. I had agreed to go through Grandma's belongings to save my mother the heartache. I was even looking forward to spending time with my son, Rowan, in the same house I had so many happy memories from his age. However, this process was not the fun, sentimental trip down memory lane I had envisioned. Grandma had taken to hoarding in her final years, and trying to separate the trash from the valuables was a time-consuming feat. Plus, my son's constant energy and demand for attention from his mom and me led to me snapping and yelling at him much more than I'm proud to admit. After I had almost lost my mind over him accidentally shattering a glass snow globe that I knew Grandma had really loved, my wife decided it was time to call it a night and get some rest. We had planned to get a hotel, but due to our exhaustion, we decided to just crash in the guest bedroom, all three of us falling onto the bed. This room was surprisingly untouched by Grandma's hoard. I passed out almost immediately. I awoke later to the sound of my wife's voice floating from across the room. I could barely hear her and was sure she was trying not to wake me, but I've always been an incredibly light sleeper. When I heard Rowan's voice whisper back, I assumed she was just up to help him find his way to the bathroom in the hoard and rolled over to go back to sleep. Instead, I snapped wide awake when I saw my wife sleeping peacefully beside me and no Rowan between us. I sat up in bed and turned towards the closet where the voices were coming from. Dreadful memories rushed back to me as I saw my son crouched in front of the closet door and made out the words that were being said. "Daddy should never yell the way yours does, Rowan. Why aren't you stopping him?" A distorted version of my wife's voice was whispering. I don't know," Rowan answered. "You know what you need to do, Peanut," the thing cooed. I'd heard enough. I jumped out of bed and barreled across the room, throwing the door open. Nothing was there. I searched through the hanging clothes and the boxes of junk to no avail. Whatever had been talking to my son was gone. We left that night and have never returned. I let my brother finish up the rest of the packing. I never want to see that room, and especially that closet, ever again.
The nurse sitting across from me was looking inside the binder, confused. She flipped through one page after another, sifting through progress notes and orders. Around us were the sounds of a dozen other voices speaking at the same time, discussing patients and their care plans, bed movements and medications, physiotherapy and discharge follow-ups. "I just met him this morning," she said. "I wish I could be of more help. But like I said, he's a John Doe, so we don't know much about him." "Ah, here it is. Maybe this will give us something." There was a hastily scrawled progress note from the day of admission. It read, "Integumentary. Midline abdo-lateral incision appears to be infected. A wound covered with newspaper. On admission per triage. +++ purulent drainage noted. Erythema, foul smell. Possibly old pericardial incision, but no sternal or femoral sites found. Will order wound care to assess and follow." That's it? I guess so. It's been really busy lately though. They probably didn't have a lot of time. There were other notes as well, but nothing concerning the wound. Alright. I guess I'll just have to take a look at the thing for myself, I said, standing up. "Is he with it?" That's hospital code for, is he going to hit me or scream bloody murder when I rip the bandage off? Is he confused or is he with it? She hesitated. No, not with it, I wouldn't say. But then it's hard to really tell. He doesn't say anything, and if you try to look him in the eyes, he just looks right through you. Sounds like he's probably confused. Maybe nonverbal? Yeah, I would have thought so too. But there's something about him. You know how they say they can see intelligence in the eyes? Well, when I look him in the eyes, or try to, it's like there's some... She stopped and looked embarrassed. Some what? This is going to sound stupid. I should probably just stop talking. There were people all around, but nobody was listening. The other nurses and doctors had other topics on their mind and were all engaged in other matters. "What is it?" I asked, curious now. Her face softened and she opened up and told me. "It's like when you look him in the eyes, there's somebody really wise looking back at you. Somebody way smarter than me. It's almost like he doesn't even want to look at you because he's off somewhere else in his mind. Or like he doesn't think we're worth his time. Like I said, This probably sounds really stupid. Not at all, I said back to her, thinking I would have to go and see for myself. Do you want me to come with you? She asked. It's okay, you're busy. Go ahead and deal with your other patients. If you hear me calling for you, just come and give me a hand, will ya? For sure, she said and quickly ran off to deal with other matters. Call bells were ringing constantly, and around every corner someone was coming quickly with a tray of food or a stretcher, a cleaning cart or a medication cup in hand. I made my way through the semi-organized chaos and walked down the hallway towards room 14. It was the furthest room from the nursing station, and as I walked past a few others, I heard patients inside calling out, screaming, wailing in pain and terror of invisible enemies. I stopped once or twice and looked in to see nurses were already engaged in helping some of them, while other staff members put on bright yellow isolation gowns and gloves and prepared to enter different rooms. The powerful odor of infection wafted out of room 14 as I approached. I doused myself with hand sanitizer like a priest with holy water at the threshold and quickly gowned and gloved, walking into the room and into the thick of it. As I entered room 14, I saw a man lying in bed. He was staring at the ceiling and did not acknowledge me when I said my greetings. Hello, sir. My name is Jerome and I'm a wound care nurse. I'm here to take a look at your dressing. I hear you've got a bit of a hole in your abdomen there, and the doctors would like to see what I can do to help. Is that okay with you? He did not say anything. I stepped forward and stood at the side of the bed. Pushing the button on the side of the bed rail, I made the whole thing go up, raising it to waist height. I'm just going to pull back the sheets and take a look here, okay? Again, he said nothing. I pulled down the bed sheets and pulled up his hospital gown, revealing a hairy chest and abdomen with a patchwork of bandages covering his stomach. Slowly, I began to pull them away one by one. I watched his face closely, ready to back away at any sign of anger or agitation. A pericardial incision is typically made during a coronary artery bypass graft procedure, more commonly known as open heart surgery, but it is one of several large cuts made during the procedure. The sternum will have a large vertical incision at the midline of the chest. There will also be incisions made in one or both legs, depending on the quantity of artery being harvested for the procedure. This is all important for the simple reason that Mr. John Doe had none of these scars, no wounds from any other surgical incisions, and yet here was this long lateral scar on his abdomen, isolated and alone, no other wounds anywhere. The man appeared malnourished and thin, like he hadn't eaten anything in a very long time. The nurse had said he was refusing to eat, and the next step was to insert a nasogastric tube later that day. Looking at the wound, I saw it was macerated and red, wet and white in places, pruny like fingers after being in the bath for too long. There was an odor coming from it, a rank and putrescent sink like death and infection. My job could be interesting and rewarding some days, but this was shaping up to be a hell of a morning. Of course, I had no idea. Not yet. The smell only became worse as I began my work. I cleansed the wound with a massive amount of saline and watched as yellow pus seeped out in vast quantities. Once it began to run clear, I dried it with gauze as best as I could. The whole time the man just stared at the ceiling, looking like he was far superior to all of this, like none of it was important. I quickly cleansed my hands with hand sanitizer, then laid out my sterile field. I set out my fresh sterile gloves and opened my dressing tray and my packing gauze. Also, I took out a swab so I could measure the depth of the hole. After putting on my sterile gloves, I plunged the swab into the wound and began to explore it from multiple angles, trying to determine its size. Width, depth, height was all that was needed, and then I could start to pack it. All the while it seeped and stank. The wound edges seemed to move and twitch as I worked, as if it was a mouth and I was a dentist poking around inside. But that was silly. I thought to myself. It was just the visor fogging up, distorting my vision, of course. I managed to measure its width and height, but couldn't determine the depth. The whole time I was observing the patient's face and seeing he didn't flinch or grimace with any of my prodding. I was thankful he wasn't swinging at me, at least, as some others did. Next was the final part of everything. I just had to pack the wound and cover it with a dry dressing. Then I could finally get away from the smell of that room. Deciding it would take far too long with tweezers, I simply used the sterile gloves to pack the hole in the man's abdomen. I lightly began to fill the wound, staring at the outside edges. As my hand went into the center of it, I began to feel something pulling hard on my fingers, like one of those finger trap toys I had played with as a kid. The sensation was so unusual and bizarre, given the circumstance that I was completely shocked and couldn't even open my mouth to scream. I just tried to wrench my hand away desperately. The thing inside the man's abdomen held fast. Then something sharp started to slice into my finger, and that was enough to bring me back to reality, and I remembered I could call for help. I let out a howling scream, wailing at the top of my lungs in horror and pain. Looking at the man's face, I saw he was no longer catatonic. He was staring straight at me now, his blue eyes shining with satisfied intelligence. He appeared to me suddenly like a man who has not eaten for a very long time, who was finally getting a meal. My screams rang out in the room, but I realized with dawning terror that the other confused patients in the room surrounding this one were also screaming loudly, probably drowning out my calls for help. As my eyes darted around the room for something to help the situation, I felt my hand getting sucked in like a ramen noodle being slurped up by a greedy mouth. Sharp teeth dug into the flesh of my fingers at the same time, and then were up to my knuckles, then my palm. I reached over with my other hand and tried to pull my wrist, trying to yank it free. It hurt more than anything I had ever felt in my life as I pulled against the razor-sharp teeth, and they ripped through my flesh. The man's face was smug and self-satisfied, and I felt his stomach mouth pull me in deeper, now ingesting my hand nearly up to the wrist. I pulled my other hand away as it tried to suck that one in too. The whole time I continued to scream and scream, now using my foot as leverage against the bed frame, doing anything I could to get it out, to get it away. It felt like fire in my hand, burning me up to my wrist. The pain was so severe I felt like I would black out, but I managed to stay conscious as I fought and pulled against the strength of this horrifying alien creature. I glanced again at the man's face and saw his tongue looked black inside his mouth, his teeth yellowed and missing in places. He began to laugh, but the sound didn't come from his face. Just as the world began to go red and then black around the edges, I heard a sound from behind me of someone entering the room. My wrist was freed as the giant mouth had merely opened up and released it. I fell backwards against the wall, my forearm a bleeding stump that I held up and looked at dumbly. The nurses who entered the room said later that they didn't see the man smiling or hear him laughing as they entered. He looked catatonic as always. What they did see was a hysterical nurse on the floor, weeping and screaming and missing a hand. A trail of blood leading to the bedside and to a hole in the man's abdomen. A very unusual wound that was now turned up at the edges, like a satisfied smile. They were always there, not actively present, but sitting somewhere in the deepest back of my mind. The memories. Memories of long slides and big trampolines, as well as colorful tables where we had snacks and juice boxes. Memories of a climbing tower with leaves and tree branches where you could climb like a monkey. The monkey trees are the most vivid ones for some reason. The rest are mainly colors and a few noises. Noises of children's laughter and repetitive music, very faint somewhere in the background. As a child, you don't notice music as much. The colors I see when I try to think of the Funland are mostly green. Probably the monkey jungle I'm thinking about, but there are hints of bright pink and yellow too. Most distant memories of activities I did as a little kid are like that. I'm 23 now, pretty long ago, so I suppose it makes sense. It also makes sense that I remember blurps of color instead of real events and faces. I must have been 6 or 7 then. I can't say for sure because of the gaps in my head. Well, my mind. The children's funland with the monkey climbing trees, music, and snacks. It would be one of those memories you simply have of your childhood. You don't remember it at all, but it is still a fine piece of nostalgia buried somewhere inside of you. I've done loads of stuff as a kid. Nobody actively thinks of it on a regular basis, and the only reason I'm starting this trip down memory lane now is because for some unspeakable reason, the Kicky Kids Funland suddenly became completely sharp and vivid, and that is not how brains are supposed to work. It sounds bonkers, I know. Odd because I know what the blurry memories look like, and so strange because now I can distinguish between those and the new ones I suddenly have. The vivid ones. Sounds strange. Yeah, it is, but that's not all. The memories didn't only come back to me, but also to Maxie Millers, my childhood best friend who I probably hadn't talked to in more than a decade. I woke up from a long sleep after a drunken night at the bar. I hadn't been drinking in forever and my tolerance was crazy low. After basically falling into a coma back at home, I had the most vivid dream. The following morning, my eyes opened wide as the beams of light shining through the drapes kissed, or rather hit my face. First, there was pain. I'd forgotten how horrible hangovers can be, but then I repressed the pain to focus on the last dream I had that night. The dream that woke up all those memories of Kicky Kids Land. Suddenly it felt as if all of it happened only yesterday, and I even wondered if I'd somehow gone there while completely being hammered. No, that couldn't be because in those memories I was a kid, and all the other ones there were too. You know how you always see yourself in a third-person perspective when you think of something that happened? Well, I saw child Jamie running around the plastic, or rather trampoline-like soft floor. It was all green. Forest green tiles mixed with poison green once. They bounced a little when you ran fast enough, and we always did. That's when I remembered Maxie. Well, I never forgot about his existence, of course. We simply weren't as close after going to different high schools. Tiny pink plastic tables with rainbow-colored chairs around them, which seemed much bigger then. The same irritating tune repeating over and over again, accompanied by children screaming, laughing, and crying. Our poor parents must have left with a migraine each time. I was surprised by how vivid those memories suddenly were, and for the first time in years, I kind of missed my old friend and wondered how he'd been doing. The headache was suddenly very much present again. I groaned and tried to suppress the pain just a little longer as I reached for my phone on the bedside table, and as if he somehow had read my mind, I saw a Facebook message from Maxie. "Hey man, how's it going?" Typical Max. We hadn't spoken in years and he texted as if we never stopped being friends. What the fuck? I mumbled to myself. This was too much of a coincidence. Had he somehow read my mind? Well, it turned out that I had no idea how much further this would go. After a little bit of chit-chat, I got to the point and told him about my dream, about my memories of Kicky Kids and that I saw him in my dream. That last part sounded really weird and I almost regretted saying it until he texted back. No fucking way, Jamie. That's exactly why I texted you. I had a dream like that. I broke a cold sweat, not knowing whether it was due to my hangover or the absurdity of the situation. It was all too crazy, but luckily my old friend agreed. I wasn't alone in losing my mind. Do you remember where it was? Can't find it on Google. After jumping, or rather crawling out of bed, I chugged down some water with a few painkillers and called my mom. Her memories were even more blurry than mine. She said we went to a couple of different places for kids back then, and she was right. Kiki Kids didn't ring a bell, but then again she didn't remember any of the names. Finally, my friend Max did find something though. On some forum of our town, and after talking about it some more, we decided to meet again to catch up with some coffee and take a walk towards the industrial area where the Kiki building was supposed to be. What could be the harm in checking it out after all? I mean, they probably shut it down, right? We spent more than 2 hours at a cafe Max suggested, near the district he moved to. He only moved back recently after his dad broke his hips to help out and stuff. He had been in a relationship during most of college, but they broke up more than 6 months ago. However, that was most of the catching up we did. For the rest of the 2 hours we sat there talking about our childhood, the only common topic we had. Finally, we addressed the elephant in the room. How the actual fuck did we have the same dream last night? I stayed silent for a second. I'd been thinking about it all day. I'm not exactly a superstitious person. I studied psychology. I'm aware of the ability of our minds. Maybe we saw some commercial? Subconsciously woke up that memory? Maybe. Still weird though. I swear I remember every second. Even how you fell on the floor and messed up your knee. I swallowed. That is exactly what I had seen in my dream before I woke up this morning. For some reason, that particular moment didn't feel cheerful. Or maybe I'm thinking that because I woke up with a racing heartbeat. Now Max was grinning. Want to go check it out? I nodded. That was the main reason we met up after all. Neither of us expected it to still be around. Many old places were shut down, especially in the industrial area, and if it was still there we would have found it more easily online. That's why we stood with our mouths wide open as we looked up the enormous green neon sign that read, Kiki Kids Land, fun for young and old. I gulped. Looks exactly the same, Max said as if reading my mind. I expected the building to appear old or run down, but it was clean and the sign is lit up, which means there is electricity. They're still open, I said. Should we go in? Hell yeah. It says young and old, right? I grinned. And I swore at that moment it didn't matter that we had lost touch for years. It felt as if I was back with my best friend, and we were up for a crazy adventure. The door was open, and as we entered the entry hall, I could already hear the familiar music in the distance. There was a big desk in front of us where you would pay, but there were no other people. What now? I asked. Max shrugged and then pointed towards the big door which formed a half circle with a thin curtain hanging down from it. That's how you got to the main hall of the Funland. We could hear laughter and music coming from behind it. That was the first moment in which I got a little nervous. We had been acting pretty impulsively. Should we go? I asked. Inside? Max misinterpreted. I meant to leave, but now I was really curious. We could take one tiny peek and leave afterward. Max led the way and I followed. Before we knew it, we stood in the fun hall of Kiki Kids Land. It looked exactly the way I remembered it. The plastic tables, the gummy floor, and rainbow chairs. There were colorful slides and even indoor swing sets. The walls were painted with teddy bears and lollipops and fire trucks. Everything looked exactly the way it did back then, but it was incredibly eerie. There's no one here, Max whispered. I swallowed. I could have sworn that I heard children laughing and screaming even. Now, all we heard was the music. Max and I looked at each other. Maybe they're getting ready to close down? It's pretty late. He nodded. A knot was tightening in my stomach. We should get going, I said as I took one more look around the big hall, but then I noticed something. Wait, where's the jungle, where you could climb? Max took another step inside and I reluctantly followed. He'd always been a little braver, or dumber. That wasn't here, he answered after a bit. That was a different Funland or whatever. Are you sure? How many of these are there? Max didn't answer. He was now confidently walking towards the other side of the hall. There's someone there, he exclaimed. Hello? He shouted. What the fuck, man? I hissed. We're not even supposed to be here. As I caught up to him, I saw the person he was talking about, but they didn't look quite regular. Is that a clown? I asked, but didn't expect an answer. The tall man had white makeup on his face, was wearing a red wig and a big red nose, as well as a black and white clown costume. He started moving towards us, but not in a regular manner. He was somehow jumping while walking extremely slowly. I grabbed Max's arm and got ready to get the hell out of there, but then the man smiled and waved. I fucking hate clowns, Max whispered. Only then I noticed how tense he was. I suppose his confidence was slowly fading. Hello, the clown called back in the same tone as Max. I'm not sure if my friend noticed as well, but somehow his voice even sounded like his. Hey, sorry, we just came in here. We wanted to see if this place still looked the same as it did when we were kids. I nervously laughed. The man came closer and I noticed that it wasn't makeup on his face, but a mask. Hey, this place is sorry. I hate kids, the man said. Now his voice was even stranger. It partly sounded like Max, but also somehow like me. Is he screwing with us? Max tried to joke, but I clearly heard the nervous undertone in his voice. Let's get the hell out of here. But as I turned around to where the exit should be, I realized that it wasn't there. The door wasn't where we had come from. All I saw in front of me were colorful toys in giant sizes and climbing racks or slides. Something had changed while we were inside, and I cursed myself for not listening to my gut and following a guy I hadn't talked to in years. Suddenly I even wondered if I really ever came to Kicky's before. Suddenly everything seemed utterly and awfully wrong. I felt as if I was waking up from a trance. Why was I here? Why was there music and light but no people except for one clown? And why was there no proof of this place even existing? I hadn't thought about it until this day, apparently. It had melted with other memories of mine. Had it been planted inside my mind? I looked at my old friend who suddenly didn't seem that familiar anymore. I blacked out pretty badly last night. Had he done something to me? Was this even the Maxie Millers I remembered? I looked back, but the clown was gone. The clown was gone, but the sound of children playing and laughing was back. Except now the two of us seemed to be alone in this massive hall. I didn't even look at Max again. I simply started running. If I couldn't find the door, at least I needed to get away from him. I ran towards something that seemed to be a ball pit. The music and laughter got louder and my mind was too overwhelmed to even think clearly. This couldn't be a prank. The door disappeared. It was there a few minutes ago. I kept running without a safe goal, and as I tried to quickly turn around to see if he was following me, I tripped. I fucking tripped and fell to the ground, with my knee hitting the ground so hard that my arms followed quickly. As I tried to get up, I saw him. The clown standing right in front of me. Not supposed to be here. Hell is fun, he said in that voice that was both mine and the one of Max. I wanted to get up, but my body was frozen. I could hardly even breathe. Only when I thought it couldn't get worse, he proceeded to take off his mask, and underneath revealed something so utterly wrong and uncanny that I will never be able to wipe it off my mind. His face had been sewed out of different parts of human faces. I was sure this moment would be my last until someone grabbed my arm and started pulling. "Move!" Max shouted, and as I didn't know what else to do, I followed. We ran to the other side of the hall, where the door had suddenly appeared back out of nowhere. I was certain it had been in a whole different corner when we came in, but it didn't matter. We ran and ran until we pushed open the glass door and were back out on the street. I fell again and so did Max, but we were outside. Completely out of breath, I turned my head around just a bit to see if we were being followed. The clown wasn't behind us. No, not only was he gone, Kicky Kids Land wasn't behind us. All we saw was an old gray brick building. No sign and no music. It was the middle of the day, and while there weren't that many people out on the street, it seemed completely normal, as if we hadn't just jumped out of a nightmare. I looked at Max, who was just as out of breath as me, and who appeared just as shocked, and I felt guilty for believing that he tried to lure me in there, for believing that he wasn't himself. He was the one who saved me. "How did you find the exit?" I finally muttered as we were getting away from that street as fast as we possibly could. I was leaning on Max because I could hardly walk. He grabbed for his phone with sweaty hands to call for help, though I had no idea what we would even say. "The walls move," he finally said after taking a deep breath. I remembered from my dream. I remembered the fun land vaguely. The one with the monkey climbing park. That one was real. Max and I really did go there as kids. Maybe it shut down or became a different place. The place we visited that day was not. Kicky Kids Land did not exist, and neither do the memories we had of it. Of course, it couldn't have. The memories were far too sharp to be real. I have no idea who or what planted them in our heads to lure us to that place, but we were lucky we got out alive.
The woman at the door said her husband was inside my home. She was agitated and ran her fingers through her unwashed hair. "You have the wrong address. It's just me," I said, then lied. "And my boyfriend is here." No, please, just listen to me," she said, placing a hand on the door frame and leaning in towards me. I said I couldn't help her, said again she had the wrong address, then shut the door. But I could still hear her. "I don't know what he'll do. Let me in. Let me find him," she said, her muffled voice sharpening while her palm drummed on the door. "He stands still." I froze in the entryway and waited full minutes after it sounded like she had left, in case her ear was pressed to the door. I didn't give much thought to her husband at first. There was something off about her. How she tried to talk so calmly, even though it was obvious she was coiled tight enough to snap. She kept floating on her toes, looking into my apartment behind me. But she also didn't seem outcast, or even neglected really. Her cashmere sweater and tapered pants told a different story. So, I searched my apartment with the crowbar I kept under the sheets in the linen closet. No one was in the front rooms, with their windows facing the street. I had been there all day, so it was impossible for anyone to have broken in that way. Then I remembered the old dumbwaiter shaft. It was behind the kitchen door, shut behind a hinged metal slab, to keep noise from bleeding between apartments. It was no longer an open shaft, but a dusty compartment used as a pass-through for cables. I brought along my biggest chef knife from the drawer across from the refrigerator. The steel panel was painted the same color as the wall and had no handle or latch. Instead, there was a small jagged hole punched in one side with several drill bit plunges. I dug a screwdriver out of the junk drawer and tried to pry it open with a single jerk, so I could step back and hold out the blade in my other hand. Instead, it swung open with a painfully slow creak, and I dropped the knife, scaring myself even more when it clattered at my feet. Without thinking, I bent down to pick it up. Kneeling on the floor, I imagined a pale hand reaching out into my hair and skull, but when I stood up and looked inside, there was nothing there. Just the dark. It was empty. When I left the kitchen and crossed by the front door again, I saw that the woman had shoved a piece of paper in my door like a takeout menu. It was a torn envelope, like something pulled crumpled from the trash, and had written on it the words, "Listen, please." Then I heard her whisper from low down on the door, even below where I had kneeled to pull at the scrap of paper. The first time my husband was around the corner from our French doors, in the hollow where my desk meets the printer cabinet. He must have been there all morning. He was standing straight up, like a sunflower, but I didn't see him until I got up from the desk and bumped my ankle. When I looked up suddenly, he was there, staring at nothing. The second time, he was behind an all-glass display case in our entryway, pinched between a pane and the wall just inside the front door. The whispering stopped and I realized I was barely breathing. I was still kneeling and my knees were beginning to get sore. "Are you still there?" the whispered voice asked. I didn't answer. "He's gotten really skinny and goes through tubes of high SPF sunscreen whenever he is called out to a site, so now he's white as an electric socket. He can suppress his presence and take away your intuitive sense that another person is nearby. He's practicing. He's getting better. He knows where your eyes land and the spaces they slide over." "Go away," I screamed, before retreating to the farthest corner of my apartment away from the front door. It took me a while to calm down, with some TV and all the lights on. I didn't pay attention to the show, but told myself that the woman at the door had a mental illness and a persecution complex, and she wanted to pull me into her delusion. I crept to the window and peered into the park across the street from my house. It was small and mostly mown, with a picnic pavilion and a swing set. But right across from me was a shock of forest, rising up, curling and unwanted. The sun was still up, but low enough for this thicket to be dark in its own shadows. I looked for her there, expecting I don't know what, 2 red eyes. I didn't see her and opened the blinds fully. A few families were playing volleyball down at the farthest end of the park, but it was otherwise empty. Then I caught the blue light of an e-cig. It was her, seated in a shadowed beach chair, with her legs stacked casually in front of her. I could barely see her face, but it looked as if she was staring into my windows. I debated whether to go out to confront her, but when I turned around I saw her husband. I didn't scream. My throat snapped shut on my breath. Through the kitchen doorway across the room I could see my dishwasher, and him standing next to it, one leg against the fridge. He wasn't standing straight, but bent forward at a right angle, his back aligned with the marble countertop. One arm was held pinned against his thigh, the other down, then the wrist up, with fingers out in odd angles. His face pointed forward, aligned atop his body like a bullet on a shell casing, with his eyes aimed to one side of me and far away. He wore an expression of rapture on a pale face. His lips were glittering red. He didn't move or react and showed no signs of being detected, but I still expected those eyes to swivel and land on me. Didn't feel I could move or look away until it did. I forced myself to clap, then to wave my arms, but there was no reaction. "You," I said. "Sir," I added, "you need to leave." He didn't react, and it wasn't just as if he was ignoring me. There wasn't a tremor or breath. He stayed so still it was as if the whole world had frozen. I called 911, of course. The operator urged me to get out of the house as quickly as possible. I stayed on the line with the operator, but there was nothing left to say. My only way out was past him. Acid filled my stomach. There was no way I could cross that room. I considered tossing something at him or attacking him, but there was nothing more dangerous than a TV remote nearby. The operator said something about officers on the way, and my phone slipped from my hand in my rush to bring it back to my ear. My eyes never dropped from the husband, who didn't flinch when my phone crunched on impact, then clattered across the floor and under the couch. I lowered myself to my hands and knees and considered crawling over and reaching under, until I realized it would put him out of sight. It was better to escape. Maybe I could crawl by him without touching him and he'll stay frozen. Or would he just grab me when I get close? I didn't have a choice. At the threshold between hardwood and tile, I looked down at my hands on the floor, and when I looked up, he was gone. But it was only for an instant, because suddenly I could see him again just in front of me. He hadn't moved. My eyes had let him go and struggled to find him again, like he wasn't where I had expected, or if I had somehow forgotten him. The arms holding me up shook so violently that I pitched forward, landing on the side of my face with a smack. I landed right at his feet, but didn't touch him. Pushing back on the heels of my hands, I rolled backwards and slammed into the cabinet behind me, hard enough that I heard the fiberboard crack inside the door. I could crawl by him now, but first watched him for any sign of movement. He was in a khaki t-shirt that didn't quite match the wood cabinetry or stand out from the white refrigerator at his back. Nor were his dark pants much of a match for the brushed chrome of the dishwasher, though I could see he had a sliver of something shimmery silver, like a lanyard loop, hanging out from his pocket. I don't know how he could have disappeared from my sight, but he didn't seem to notice me. I strained to keep an eye on him over my shoulders as I crawled past, until I couldn't move slowly any longer. I scrambled to my feet, tumbling into a standing position, then into a headlong run, where I couldn't tell my heartbeats from the pounding of the feet on the floor. After struggling with the lock, I finally squeezed through my front door and shut it behind me without looking back. The police came, searched my apartment, found no one. I tried to explain that he might still be there, that they just hadn't seen him, but they wouldn't come back in with me. They wouldn't search the park either. They were annoyed I wouldn't go back inside, but eventually left. I didn't have my phone and didn't know where to go, so I wandered out of my building in a daze. It was dark out now, but the night air felt good. I saw a car double parked, but didn't pay it any attention until the woman pushed open the passenger side door from the driver's seat and waved me over. I'd be embarrassed to describe the horrible things I said to her, but she was calm and composed. She knew how to handle her husband standing still, and was nothing like the woman who first confronted me on my doorstep. I don't want to give her a real name, so I'll call her Flora. "I'll teach you to see him," was the first thing Flora told me, once I was able to listen. I didn't want to see him, or to go anywhere near this person, but I didn't know what else to do. She drove me far outside of the city, until I could see stars over a sprawling suburbia. Somewhere nearer the highway, where duplex condos faded into industrial parks, she turned into a multi-acre construction site. It was all blonde dirt, scraped and marked by bulldozer treads. At the center was a cinder block frame that might one day grow into a big box store. She turned off her headlights, and suddenly the feeling I had ignored, in favor of her serene understanding of my situation, could no longer be ignored. I was struck dumb with fear, my sore muscles protesting at being called back to alert. Had I met a couple working together? But she kept talking reasonably, kept her instructions simple, and I found no moment to protest. Instead, I followed her, even let her take me by the hand and pull me, in a circuitous path out into the center of the standing blocks. She laid out a picnic blanket and urged me to lay on my back next to her with a friendly pat. Inside, I was screaming. "We're in the middle of one of the dimmer meteor showers that doesn't get headlines," she said, "but we can see one every few minutes if we know how to look. Men who stand still," she told me, "can't be searched out like a bird among branches or a face in the crowd. That is a search for specificity. Even if you could live in a state of constant scrutiny, where every pixel of reality is examined, you would not often find these unmoving men. They slip into your scotoma and escape your attention because they are no longer objects to be found." "There was one," she said, pointing to a part of the sky. "Did you see that one?" I hadn't. "Because you were darting around looking for shooting stars," she said, instead of looking at the surface of reality. Her husband had receded into the sky of our day-to-day existence, she said. When standing still, he wasn't an object to be found in space, but had shut down every part of himself to become permanent. She taught me to make my eyes flat and to search without an idea of what I wanted to see. To see them, you can no longer want anything from the sky, she said. You have to deaden yourself to know what surrounds you. I laughed when I saw the first shooting star and forgot about my terrible day. Then there was another and another. "Now, please, please, don't be afraid," she said, sitting up and placing her hand on my goose-pimpled forearm. I looked around with my meteor eyes. There were men standing in strange shapes, pressed against the cinder blocks and standing in the mud at bent angles, and even across the street, holding themselves straight. I see them